There's a moment early in keajaibanku when the city seems to hold its breath. The camera drifts past rain-polished glass and sleepless office windows, the hum of Jakarta at 2 a.m. like a living creature, and a single paper crane flutters in an updraft inside a high-rise lobby, as if even the air is conspiring to pull off something small and tender, and that image feels like a promise, the movie quietly saying, "Come closer. I'm going to show you how ordinary life becomes miraculous if someone just pays attention," and if you're anything like me, that promise is all it takes to set your heart pattering, because that's what this film really is, a map of attention, a meditation on how care can look like magic when we are starved of it in a world of metrics and meetings and midnight emails, and right away you know you're watching a film from a country and a city that finds poetry in traffic, warmth in stormlight, and a little superstition in the space between breaths. Before we continue, please subscribe to my channel Scenecraft Review, and let us know where you are listening from in the comments. Now, this is a 2025 release, arriving just as Indonesian cinema hits a new stride of confidence after years of steady ascent, and it's the kind of movie that doesn't announce itself with explosions or flashy cameos but with the quiet authority of a storyteller who trusts the texture of streets and the weight of a gaze. It comes from a team that understands romantic drama isn't just about two people staring at each other but about how a city watches them, how an office corridor echoes beneath their footsteps, and how luck and faith and accident weave a net that catches them when they fall. And say what you will about the CEO romance trope that has been circulating across screens in Asia, this one almost sneaks up behind the trope, taps it on the shoulder, and walks past, because although it knows its genre, it refuses to be predictable, instead mixing in a strain of magical realism that feels less like an escape and more like a way of naming the things we feel but can't measure. Like the tingle in your spine when a memory returns without being summoned, or the hush that arrives just before you say a truth you've avoided for years, the film opens with Kirana, a junior brand strategist who rides the MRT at dawn with a thermos of jamu wrapped in batik cloth and a notebook she calls keajaibanku, my miracles, a battered little thing filled with sketches and fragments and private rules of kindness. And she talks about them in voiceover not like spells but like recipes for paying attention. A list that includes things like bring an umbrella for someone who forgot, say the mother's name when she shows you her child's photo, leave the window open when it rains if you're safe, because the world likes to come in and sit with you. And then there's Aga Mahendra, an exhausted, exacting CEO whose company, a fintech firm that grew too fast, is wearing him down like stones wear down the soles of shoes. A man who watches metrics like they're clouds he can shape with his hands, except whenever his alone the sound design softens to a high ring, a little note of tinnitus that might as well be his conscience trying to hum above the numbers. Their first meeting is not engineered as a meet cute, it's an accident of weather and timing, an elevator that lurches to a stop between floors during a monsoon storm, and the emergency lights turn the cabin steel into warm gold. And a child in the corner grumbles a prayer against thunder, and Kirana folds a paper crane from a receipt and leaves it in the child's palm, whispering this one eats fear, and Aga pretends not to watch but fails, his gaze traveling the way rain does down glass, and it's this small unscripted tenderness, caught by the camera in an almost embarrassed close-up, that signals the film's intention to show love as a collection of glances and quiet refusals to let cruelty be normal. The background details matter in a film like this. And the release window is shrewd, because early 2025 is a time when audiences are tired of cynicism disguised as adult realism and hungry for stories that admit the world's hardness but insist we can be soft without being fools. And the chatter leading up to the premiere is not about spectacle but about the approach, about whether this director would handle office power dynamics with any honesty and whether miracles would be used as cheap narrative excuses or as a real aesthetic and ethical lens. And the marketing leans into images of the city as a sentient partner, lampposts flicker as if blinking, kites hover at improbable angles, and the Wayang silhouettes slide across windows like ancestral commentary. And yes, the film knows it is leaning into tradition, and yes, it does it with dignity. As for the story, let's keep this spoiler controlled, because it's a ride best taken with fresh eyes, but we can talk about the current that moves it along. Aga's company is knee-deep in the kind of crisis that can make a reputation evaporate overnight, a scandal that sounds complex in the boardroom but simple on the street, people feeling invisible to systems built for them but not with them, and Kirana's small team in brand and community outreach is tasked with the impossible job of pulling back trust in a world that charges interest on it. And it's here the film plants one of its themes, that miracles are often just listening writ large. listening so intently that the person speaking is transformed by being heard, and the first step towards saving what can be saved is to change who is allowed to speak. We watch Aga mistake volume for clarity in those early meetings, his voice flatly efficient, keeping pain at arm's length, while Kirana says almost nothing but notices everything. The janitor's shoulders tense when the CEO passes, a receptionist clicks a pen when a number is repeated too many times, a mural across the street depicts a fish swimming upstream alone. And slowly she brings that attention into the company's bloodstream, championing a Jakarta-wide listening project that puts the firm's people in markets and warehouse and mosques and buses, giving them permission to be humans before they are employees. And there's a montage of these visits that's among the film's best, a cascade of faces and stories that feels like an embrace and a reprimand both. Reminding Aga that the living city is not his to quantify but his to serve or step aside from. Their relationship doesn't spark into romance immediately. Thank God the screenplay trusts a slow burn, because first there's an ethical conversation handled with a care you don't always see, a scene where HR walks them through boundaries and conflict of interest policies, where Kirana refuses to be a secret shadow in Aga's life and quietly insists on her agency, and he, for perhaps the first time in his leadership, yields in the presence of someone else's clarity, and that yielding becomes the film's erotic signature, not dominance but softness, not rescue but reciprocation. As they move through Jakarta, through rain and neon and the soft breath of early dawn in Tematic where the kampong meets the SkyTrain, the film paints them with patience, using long takes and frames within frames to show how the city holds them in its architecture. And the miracles are never fireworks, which is why they moved me. A street vendor's bowl lands upright after being jostled in a crowd, steam intact like a guardian breath. A second-hand bookstore slider note from a missing person falls into Kirana's hands just when a sister is looking for it. A power outage reveals a canopy of fireflies behind a warehouse, like electricity deciding to yield to bioluminescence. And later, on an out-of-office trip to Bandung to meet artisans who were promised a digital payments platform but were left alienated by jargon, it begins to rain too hard for anyone to speak above it, and there's this hushed shot where Kirana opens her palms to the downpour and convinces the group to step outside under the eaves, letting the rain be a metronome, syncing their words to its rhythm, and the conversation becomes both literal and spiritual, pouring out of them as if the storm has given them permission. What are the characters like beneath their roles? Aga is not the cartoon tyrant you fear when you hear CEO romance. He's worn down, precise, unsentimental, a man who thinks problem first because he has never learned to trust yes when it arrives without proof. And there's a wound there that the screenplay doesn't name for a while but hints at with sound and image, specifically that ring in his ear that spikes with anxiety, and a recurring shot of him tightening his cufflinks like someone bracing for an impact nobody else anticipates. Kirana, meanwhile, made of sunlight and stubbornness, is not naive, and the movie earns her optimism by showing us her practice, that she works at being kind the way other people work at being efficient. And kindness in this film is not weakness but muscle, and you feel it in the small things she refuses to let slide. She doesn't allow a colleague's public shaming to go unchallenged. She brings food to an overnight team and leaves before anyone can thank her. She argues with Aga not to be right but to keep him honest when he's tempted by a beautiful lie. There's also Bu Sita, Kirana's grandmother, who runs a jamu shop and serves as a kind of moral calibrator for the movie. Old school and unsentimental, with a sense of humor so dry it might evaporate, and her scenes are small masterclasses in writing. She pops an ice cube into a hot jamu and says watch it vanish. That's what happens to anger when it meets something larger than itself. And she invites Aga to lift a mortar and pestle to grind herbs as if weight and repetition are rituals that teach humility better than any lecture. On the cinematic front, I have to say the film is gorgeous, and not in a tasteless wallpaper way, but in a way that understands the grammar of tenderness, long lenses that compress the city into swaths of texture, handheld scenes that tremble with nervous possibility, the color palette sliding from storm blues and sodium golds into those bruised purples you get just before the dawn lifts its head, and then those frames where everything goes still and the camera behaves like a listener, conceding the floor to a tremor in a voice or a sudden on-screen silence that punishes the viewer in the best way by refusing to move on until they've truly felt it. The sound design is quietly radical too, especially in the way it renders Aga's tinnitus not just as a symptom but as a storytelling tool when he's about to make a decision that will hurt someone. The ring sharpens, the background hum of the office thins, and we are left stranded with him in a kind of sonic accountability chamber. The musical score threads gamelan with understated synths, sometimes letting a single siren note hang in air like a held breath, and at other times warming the frame with strings that sound like light filtered through batik. Pacing-wise, it's deliberate, and there's a stretch in the second act where the film lingers long on community scenes. A deliberate choice that may test those hoping to sprint, but there is intent in that deceleration. The movie wants to teach us how to sit with people and listen without looking at the clock, and the payoff comes later when those faces return at crucial junctures like a chorus stepping out of the dark to answer the lead's questions. Thematically, the film places ambition and grace in a room together and asks if they can share a meal. And while it doesn't pretend that power dynamics are easily fixed by individual goodness, it does suggest that transparency and structure matter, showing us Aga doing the thing we rarely see in these stories. He recuses himself, he sits down with HR, he tells the board that he will not continue to shape this company if it means shaping himself into a man he cannot live with, and the third act uses that choice to escalate rather than to end the story. Like a character stepping off a moving train to see what happens to momentum when it meets an obstacle, it keeps going, of course, and it forces the lovers not to resolve but to reckon and listen. There is a twist of sorts in the last stretch, a reveal that ties Kirana's keajaibanku to a private grief she has carried folded into herself for years, and the way the film handles it is the definition of spoiler-sensitive material. What I can say is that the writing respects the intelligence of pain, acknowledging that our rituals of hope are often built in the shadow of loss, and when the revelation lands, it reframes what we've been calling miracles as an ethic, that when you move through the world naming what is good and choosing to enact goodness anyway, the world sometimes answers back in kind. Performances matter deeply in a film that refuses melodrama in favor of micro-expression. And while I won't name the actors for fear of overshadowing the characters they build, I can tell you, the pair playing Aga and Kirana have that rare intimacy a camera loves, the kind that doesn't flare into obvious flirtation but smolders in the ways they occupy space near each other. He starts making tea the way she taught him without noticing he's changed his hand. She corrects his pronunciation of a client's mother's name under her breath and he nods in gratitude like she has saved him from a small cruelty. And in one of my favorite scenes, he returns to the jamu shop alone on a difficult night, and Busita tells him to slice turmeric thinner, until the knife becomes an act of respect, and there's more emotional truth in that slice than in the sob speeches movies often force men into. Among the supporting cast, the CFO who serves as Aga's friend-turned-foil is rendered with a believable blend of fear and loyalty, so that when he urges Aga to take a predatory deal, we don't hate him. We recognize a man who has convinced himself that harm is kinder than collapse, and the head of HR emerges as this quiet hero, an adult in the room who understands that ethics aren't a buzzword but a spine, and the best friend who teases Kirana at the office pantry never becomes a cartoon sidekick. She is given her own tiredness, her own conscience, which doubles the film's insistence that people exist beyond how they serve the leads. Audience reactions have been fascinating to watch. Clips of the wayang-lit scene in the small hall where the puppeteer's hands become a seminar on fate have been everywhere, a moment where he says in his steady voice that a shadow doesn't vanish when light changes, it moves, so learn to move with it, and that line has become a kind of motto for a generation raised in volatility, uncertainty, and gifts, and couples have been sharing jamu recipes in the comments like family heirlooms. While others argue in good faith about whether the film romanticizes power imbalance or confronts it with sufficient gravity, and this debate is healthy, a sign that the movie isn't just scratching our itch for catharsis but stirring our ethics, an especially pointed achievement given how easy it would have been to go for the glossy fantasy. The cultural conversation goes deeper, too, picking up on the way the film threads gotong royong, the Indonesian ethic of mutual aid, into its modern corporate arc, making sure it doesn't feel like aesthetic garnish but as a real alternative to the cult of lone genius that so often ruins people with the story that they are special enough to behave badly. And if you're watching from the diaspora, the film knows you, it gives you smells and rhythms of a home you left, whether willingly or via necessity, and it doesn't over-explain them, trusting you to catch up or to ask your elders what that spice is or why that prayer is said in that tone. And there are scattered moments around Lebanon that feel like postcards from an attic. Children practicing takbiran with makeshift drums, a late-night ride through streets strung with lights, an office that slows, finally, and lets people go home to be held by their families, without exposing the ending's engine. I want to say a word about the editing in the last half hour, which stitches anticipation and resignation together like alternating threads, letting scenes linger just long enough to feel the ache. then cutting to a small image that acts like a salve, a hand on a bus strap, a drop of rain sliding up a windshield in reverse as if time is thinking it over, a cat asleep on a ledger, and in that rhythm, the film makes you feel accompanied even as it breaks your heart a little, and when a flood arrives in the city, not a tidal wave but an inconvenience that becomes a metaphor, the company lobby fills with stranded strangers, and the richness of that sequence is in the quiet things, a CFO's shoes off and cuffs rolled up, a receptionist explaining to a child that the computer is sleeping, Aga finally sitting on the floor and listening to the sound of the building's bones with his back pressed against cool marble, and Kirana stepping over a threshold she set for herself, not to rescue him but to sit with him, the way you sit with someone at a wake, present without solving. Does the pacing wobble? Yes, briefly, when the film indulges a side plot about a competitor who might buy the company, a thread that feels like a concession to genre tension, but even there the movie's integrity holds, because it's less about deals than about decisions, about what a person thinks they are worth, and the film lands the turn by letting Aga's refusal act as a reaffirmation of everything he has learned to value on craft. I can't emphasize enough how often the director lets silence do the work, counting on our willingness to lean in, and when the characters do speak, the dialogue is careful with its aphorisms, rarely lapsing into the Instagrammable, and when it does, it catches itself with humor. Kirana laughs at her own earnestness sometimes, and that self-awareness is what keeps the film from floating away from the ground it worships. For those worried about ethical representation, rest easier. The movie is as much about consent and consent's infrastructure as it is about love. And it refuses to blur that line, offering us a scene where Kirana sets a boundary against a midnight text from Aga that is not urgent, and he apologizes not with flowers or grand gestures but by learning to wait, by rescheduling discomfort into daylight, which, honestly, is sexier than any office makeout. I'm aware I haven't talked about the miracle mechanics enough, partly because they're designed to be experimental not analytic, but here's the pattern: when someone pays an uncommon kind of attention, something shifts in the world to meet them, sometimes tangibly and sometimes as a wink, a coincidence that lands like blessing, and the film never forces us to believe, it only shows the consequences of acting as if we do, and in that acting, the characters become the people they want to be. Is keajaibanku perfect? No, and I wouldn't ask it to be, because its rough edges are the places it breathes through, the digressions into community are the lungs of the story, and the love story doesn't so much explode into fireworks as it warms a room until everyone inside loosens their shoulders, until the details of work and ritual and weather rebuild a faith in the ordinary that our world has been eroding. And as I left the theater, I thought about all the tiny miracles the movie asked me to notice on my way home. The motorcycle rider who waited for an old man to cross, the security guard who tucked a stray kitten into a cardboard box, the barista who remembered a stranger's biscuit preference, and I thought, this is what cinema can do when it cares about people, not just characters. The cultural impact will last, I think, not because it sells an aesthetic but because it makes a claim about care that's both ancient and contemporary, a claim that says our institutions will remain haunted if they forget the people inside them, and our love stories will ring hollow if they don't make space for ethics, and this movie manages to be earnest about that without becoming sermon, because it keeps returning to the particular, to the turmeric stain on a cuff, to the way a phone screen illuminates someone's face like a tiny altar, to the drumbeat of rain on metal roofing. And so, if you're wondering whether to see it, I can't tell you what your heart needs, but I can say this one understands heartbreak and repair, and it does not think love is an answer so much as a practice, a series of tiny brave choices to stay, to speak, to listen, and to laugh at yourself when you become unbearable. I see people posting that one line everywhere: miracles aren't big, they're close, and it's easy to be cynical about a line that fits neatly into a caption, but then you remember how the film earned it, through hours of proximity, through a city's pulse rising and falling with the tides of its people, through lovers who do the unglamorous work of telling the truth. And that's what stays with me now, sitting here talking to you, that in a season when we are all starved for proof that kindness isn't a fool's currency, this film offers a ledger of small balances made good. If I have one final verdict, it's this: keajaibanku is less a love story with miracles than a miracle of a love story, one that doesn't blink at the bureaucracy of living but insists on filling out all the forms with sincerity, until the stamp of approval starts to look a lot like a blessing. And if that sounds like your kind of movie, find a dark room, let the city's lights blink at you from the screen, and allow this film to argue gently with your exhaustion until you remember how to look and how to be looked at, because sometimes seeing and being seen is the miracle, and sometimes After all that, you walk outside and swear the wind says your name, and whether that's science or faith, who cares? It makes you kinder. On the walk home, and that, the film insists, is enough to change everything, if only for a night, which is all any of us really have, one long night stitched together by small acts of grace that, when you stand back and look, map out something that looks an awful lot like a miracle, and that is the map this movie hands you, folded neatly, ink smudged, with a coffee ring on page 2 like a fingerprint of fate, and it asks softly, will you open it? Will you go where it leads? Will you let it lead you back to yourself? Because that, in the end, is the only place any story is trying to get you to anyway. If the last time we talked about keajaibanku we traced the thread of small mercies drifting through the rain and office glass like quiet birds, this time I want to flip the tapestry and look at the knots, the places where care is tied to structure and where a miracle looks suspiciously like a policy rewritten at 2:37 a.m. Because in this film the difference between magic and management can be as thin as a signature line on a document, and that gap, that's where the story hums, that's where you realize the miracle isn't the improbable event, it's the consent baked into the moment, the architecture that makes kindness possible without asking anyone to beg for it. Before we continue, please subscribe to my channel Scenecraft Review, and let us know where you are listening from in the comments. We're still inside a 2025 release, but I want to reposition the camera just a few feet to the left, so instead of only seeing romance at the edge of a monsoon, we also see a company learning to be a citizen, a set of rooms that forget they were designed to extract and start to remember how to host, and in that remembering the movie becomes this rare thing, a corporate melodrama that refuses cheap catharsis and keeps asking the brave question, what does it cost to be gentler, and who pays? We meet Aga again, yes, but not in a confession booth or a sudden sunshine transformation. We meet him through his routines, the 90 minutes before a city wakes when he loops through dashboards like a monk counting beads, cross-checking figures with hands that have forgotten how to be still, and we meet Kirana at her desk in the low light of a half-empty floor, pinning a card to a corkboard that says in handwriting so patient it could be a ritual. If you're unsure, choose the option that leave someone with dignity, and that's her magic trick right there, not in the paper cranes or the glances that landed like sparrows in the first angle, but in the way she believes processes can be loving, that a system can get up in the morning and decide to stop doing harm. You can feel the film's approach shift in the first major sequence this time around, the town hall that isn't, a meeting that refuses to be a performance, because they hold it with the microphones turned off, a whole auditorium of employees and a handful of clients and vendors sitting in the round, and when people speak their names are written up on a screen next to the words they choose to offer, not as a trap but as an acknowledgement. Credit belongs to the speaker, not the company, and every 5 minutes someone walks to the center to read back what's been heard, and if you've ever sat in a meeting where the only voices that counted were the loudest, watching silence become an instrument is its own kind of wonder. The background details of release matter differently from this angle. 2025 is the year when a lot of workplaces claim well-being in their branding but still ask people to sprint on broken ankles, and this film arrives like an audit of that gap, carefully, unsentimentally, with those choices in cinematography that make you think about space not as an aesthetic venue but as a moral one. Notice how the camera keeps finding corners where people can step away from the table without leaving the conversation. Notice how the color grades soften in rooms where vulnerability is permitted and sharpen where performance is demanded, and notice how the score practically refuses crescendos when anyone is being brave, as if the movie is telling us courage doesn't need to be made bigger, it needs to be given room. Story-wise, I'll still keep the spoilers in the drawer, but it's safe to say the crisis the company faces is less a scandal in a newspaper sense and more a pattern revealed, the realization that the product worked as designed for the people with the most options and kept everyone else waiting at the gate, and the film doesn't let us off the hook by pretending one charismatic choice fixes that. What we get instead are cascades of small decisions, little valves opening and closing, a negative space where we see what happens when a CEO doesn't rush to be the hero but delegates heroism to procedures, to teams, to the boring flaws where change lives. If you're tuning in for Aga and Kirana as a couple, don't worry, that ember still glows, but in this look I'm more interested in their compatibility as builders, the way her gentleness functions as design philosophy and his precision as scaffolding, and the way they fight, in low voices and with eye contact, respecting scar tissue and deadlines, and in one of the cleanest scenes the film has. They walk a whiteboard packed with flowcharts and decision trees mapping customer restitution pathways, and there's a moment where Aga wants to make a route faster by reducing sign-offs, and she asks him who gets harmed by that speed, and he sits back and realizes the shortcut cleaves straight through someone else's night, like a train through a sleeping neighborhood, and that visual sticks with you because that's exactly how power often works when it's unexamined, beautiful on a map, brutal on the ground. Characters come into focus from slanted light now. The CFO, who in the first pass felt like a foil, here becomes the embodiment of a society-wide reflex, the one that tells us collapse would be worse than compromise, and you see in his eyes a real terror of not being able to pay the people who trusted him. So when he argues for aggressive measures, he's not greed incarnate, he's a man who learned the wrong lesson from scarcity, and the film lets him wobble and then stand, not by humiliating him but by giving him a chance to reorient around values he forgot he had. The head of HR deserves a paragraph by herself as a kind of quiet antagonist to everyone's worst impulses, a steward of boundaries, the person who refuses to trade accountability for the illusion of urgency, and the camera loves her steady hands, loves the way she pauses before agreeing, loves her role as a human throttle that keeps the company from accelerating straight into ethical guardrails, and in an era when HR is often a punchline. This movie places her as a moral engineer, and it sings, and then, of course, there's Bu Sita and the Jamu shop, whose energy in this version is less mystical hint and more praxis, a place where the film tests its thesis by returning to a unit of care older than any corporate stint, watching hands grind turmeric and pour honey and hand cups to people who arrive tired and leave slightly less so, and Aga's presence in that space is honestly the performance that sells this angle. He's awkward at first, tall and wrong-footed. His watch too shiny for the room, but when he is taught that crushing herbs is about consistency, not force, his whole posture changes, and you can see the movie whispering to him, your job is not to be spectacular, your job is to be steady. Cinematographically, this angle opens a drawer full of technical delights that double as thematic choices, the use of perpendicular lines to show contesting priorities, the way servers blink in a lab under daylight so they look less like alien hearts and more like tools, the shallow focus on hands during sequences where policy is drafted and redrafted, always hands. The way the listening groups produce drafts of promises that then get hashed out in painful iterations, and the choice to show that is a gamble, thus showing people argue about timelines and risk matrices make for riveting cinema, and somehow it does, because the director knows not to lock us in rooms for long stretches, knows to cut to the city to remind us what all this is for. A bus stuffed at dawn with women who sell cakes from Tupperware and return home smelling of sugar and diesel, a boy doing homework with his feet in a puddle under a street lamp that blinks like it's undecided, a call to prayer bending the hour into a bowl that can hold more than it should. As for themes, the movie from this side declares with its chest that speed is not a virtue on its own and that disruption is not an alibi, that if your idea of innovation is moving so fast you don't remember who fell, you haven't invented anything except a fresh kind of neglect, and that's blistering if you've ever been seduced by the romance of scale, and it's also a relief, because it says to regular people who feel left behind, your pace is not a flaw, it's a future. Performances respond to that thesis with a kind of tensile subtlety. Nobody does a redemption aria, nobody sobs into their hands while a lamp flickers just so, instead they make promises with small inflections and keep them in quiet scenes. Like the sequence where Kirana goes to a neighborhood where the company's rollout glitched most violently, and she stops at every single stall to ask what went wrong, taking notes, apologizing without collapsing into performance, offering to come back with answers only after she has a clear list of questions. And I loved the way that scene refuses the savior beat, loved how the camera stays on the faces of the vendors, puzzled, skeptical, amused, until something warms, not fully, but enough for the next step, when Aga speaks in public, too. He's careful, no thunder, no we will fix it by Friday hubris. Just a sequence of acknowledgements and commitments that sound like someone who has finally understood the cruel pleasure of moving too fast and is trying something else. Deliberate respect. Audience reaction from this angle has been fascinating, because corporate viewers, the people who spend their lives navigating calendars and approvals and stakeholders with conflicting incentives, have latched onto the film like a field manual, clipping scenes into their internal Slack channels with captions like how to run a meeting that doesn't break people. And I'm seeing, too, an entire wave of comments from gig workers and micro-entrepreneurs in Jakarta and Surabaya and Medan, people who have very little patience for corporate speeches but somehow found themselves crying at the film's depiction of someone finally coming back to check, finally sitting on a low stool and listening without checking their watch. And then from the diaspora, from Kuala Lumpur to Amsterdam to Melbourne, you can hear In the response is a hunger for a narrative that honors gotong royong without turning it into nostalgic wallpaper, that actually uses the ethic as a tool, not a mood. In terms of cultural impact, there's been this little ripple in offices where folks are starting what they're calling miracle logs, borrowing from Kirana's keajaibanku but plugging it into their workday, recording the times when systems behaved as if people mattered. Tiny shifts like a manager who waited for someone to finish a thought, like a calendar that no longer steals lunch, like a facility team that got funding to fix the elevator so that a wheelchair user didn't have to plan their day around failure. And that practice might sound small, but the movie argues and the audience seems to agree that naming goodness makes it reproducible, and reproducible goodness is the closest we get to institutional miracles. I want to talk about how the film treats risk too, because the CFO speeches in this angle win me over in a way they didn't before. He's not a villain trying to smother hope, he's the embodiment of a protective reflex around stability, and when he objects to a particular path, it's because he can see a quarter ahead where payroll becomes a question mark, and the way the film resolves that tension isn't with a Deus Ex investor but with a vocabulary change, moving from scarce or abundant to sufficient for now, from the language of conquest to the language of care, and the CFO's performance when he learns how to say we can be solvent and good is the most moving thing he does, because that is a sentence you can live inside. And oh, editing in this angle is a pedagogy, teaching viewers to enjoy the click of a process aligning with its purpose, letting a cut land right on the moment a sticky note is moved from maybe to approved, and it's funny and a little bit daring to make that feel like a romantic beat, but it works. You feel the endorphin of order without ever forgetting the humans in the frame. The city, again, is not B-roll, she's a lead, and in this angle she's framed less as a seductive blur of light and more as an organism with joints and ligaments, bridges flexing, sidewalks adapting, market tents going up at 4 in the morning like lungs expanding, and in that depiction, the film uses Jakarta not as a metaphor but as a teacher, model of resilience that doesn't glamorize suffering but honors ingenuity. If you're waiting for me to declare whether the movie romanticizes a power imbalance, let me answer carefully. It acknowledges the asymmetry and refuses to pretend it doesn't matter, and then it builds infrastructure around it so that choice can be real, both personally and institutionally. And that is rarer than a sizzle reel of sparks and stolen kisses. It is the sexiness of standards, and to watch Kirana draw a boundary and Aga respect it without sulking is to watch a love story that knows its era, a 2025 romance that has read the room. Even the so-called miracles tilt in this angle, you still get the improbable coincidence, sure. A contract that resurfaces at the moment someone needs to remember how to keep a promise, a generator that sputters back to life in a storm because a teenager figured out a workaround, but those are framed as outputs of attention, as the fruit of care, not as lightning bolts from beyond, and that reframe is, frankly, the film's moral center. Miracles are what happen when we design for them, when we leave space and time and light for them, when we are unafraid to embed generosity into the system. I cannot leave without mention of a particular sequence I haven't seen anyone isolate yet. The night the offices become a public space during another round of flooding, when the firm opens its doors not to score points but because it is the nearest dry room, and the lobby becomes a commons, and accounting interns hand out blankets as if they have always known how, and an engineer uses a CO2 sensor to manage airflow like a choir director, and a receptionist leads a child in a paper lantern craft while her mother calls a cousin stuck on a bus, and Aga stands by the coffee urn topping off cups, and nobody points a camera at him like his special. And later, when the water recedes and the lobby empties, he goes upstairs and writes a policy that says when there is rain like that, the doors will open without a meeting, and he doesn't sign it alone. He brings HR and facilities and security into the room to attach their names, because that's what power can be used for, to institutionalize the reflex you had in a good hour so you can rely on it in a bad one. Release details again if you need them. The film rolled out in theaters and then onto platforms with a chorus of think pieces about corporate ethics that were, honestly, more readable because they were anchored to a story with faces and a city with weather, and you can see in the trend lines the way conversation shifted from "are miracles real" to what would it look like to make our rooms easier on humans, and that shift is the movie's victory lap. If you're still unsure whether to watch, maybe this angle helps you decide. If you're exhausted by the way many dramas treat work either as villain or as backdrop, and you want to see it handled as a site of moral action where choices accumulate like interest, then this film will meet you where you're most tired and offer you a seat. And if you loved the first angle because it felt like someone tasted the sweetness in the rain, you'll find here that same sweetness cooked into a recipe you can follow, a set of steps. Not because the movie is prescriptive, but because it refuses to hoard hope, the final feeling. For me, in this perspective, is not swoon but steadiness, the kind of calm that arrives when someone finally flips on a light in the stairwell you've been stumbling through for years, and the light is nothing fancy, just a bulb that works, and you find your key and you walk, and halfway down you look at the camera as if to say, is this it? And the movie nods, yes, love is a bulb that works, yes, ethics is a stairwell with a handrail, yes. Miracles are often mundane until you need one, and then they're everything. And as the credits rolled, I found myself a little less impatient with the world and a little more interested in fixing the parts of it I can reach, which is maybe the greatest compliment I can pay any story, that it made me want to be useful. If you've seen it already, tell me what systems you noticed changing, tell me what small decision looked like a prayer to you, and if you haven't, go watch it with someone who knows the weight of a deadline and the relief of a boundary. Because they will hear notes in this score that you might miss, and they might speak back to the screen in a language you've been longing to learn. And as always, I'm here for the next angle too, because films like this don't end, they evolve as we do, and each time you return you'll see a new seam, a new stitch, a new design of care you missed in the rush of your own heartbeat, and when you leave the theater or close your laptop. If you feel like setting one process in your life to default tender, congratulations, the film worked on you, which is to say it worked for all of us, because that's how little miracles, institutional, personal, civic, scale. There's a moment in keajaibanku where the camera just lingers on a pair of hands, trembling over a resignation letter, rain hammering the glass behind them, the glow of the Jakarta skyline flickering like it's breathing along with the character, and it's in that quiet, fragile, almost suspended instant that you realize this movie isn't just another office romance or another CEO falls for the intern fantasy. It's trying to be a story about the exact second your life cracks open and something impossible walks in, uninvited, and calls itself a miracle. Before we continue, please subscribe to my channel Scenecraft Review, and let us know where you are listening from in the comments. So, keajaibanku, released in early 2025, slid onto the Indonesian cinema landscape at a time when everyone was already joking that maybe the only miracle they needed was a stable Wi-Fi signal and a boss who respects work-life balance, and yet this film somehow takes that very modern burnout energy and infuses it with this soft, nostalgic, almost fairy tale quality, like someone took the glossy sheen of a corporate K-drama, mixed it with Indonesian magical realism, and then stirred in just enough pain from the real world to make it sting. Directed by Rama Aditya, who previously played around with bittersweet romance in smaller indie projects, and adapted from the widely popular Wattpad novel by Nadia Parameter that had already amassed an obsessively loyal fanbase, the movie walked into theaters with a lot of expectation sitting on its shoulders, not just in Indonesia but across Southeast Asia and the global diaspora watching through streaming platforms, hoping that the film would capture what the online chapters had made them feel in the middle of the night when they were scrolling on their phones under the covers. From the very first frame, the movie makes a statement. We open not on a glamorous boardroom or a slow-motion shot of a luxury car, but on Naya, played by Prilly Latuconsina, half asleep on a rickety, rattling bus as it crawls through pre-dawn Jakarta traffic, neon reflections smearing across the window, her breath fogging the glass as she traces tiny stick figures into the condensation. She's wearing a blazer that's just a little too big, clutching a cheap tote bag with frayed handles, and you can almost smell the mix of rain, exhaust, and cold instant coffee that surrounds her, and right away the film is whispering to you, this is her story before it's anyone else's. This is about the girl who shows up to the skyscraper, not the man who owns it. We learn very quickly that Naya is the classic small-town dreamer archetype done with an unusual amount of detail. She's from a coastal town in central Java, her mother is sick but pretends not to be, her little brother is obsessed with building toy robots, and Naya is the one who made a promise years ago in a cramped mosquito-filled bedroom that she would go to Jakarta and become someone important, so that no one in her family would ever have to worry about money again. The script lets these details leak out slowly through phone calls, small conversations, and visual cues pinned up around her cramped cost room like little memory Polaroids, instead of dropping exposition on us in a clumsy way. By the time she steps into the lobby of Haloan Group, the tech logistics company where she's just landed an internship that could turn into a permanent job, we already understand what's at stake, and that's important because it makes the miracle that's coming feel earned, not just quirky. Haloan Group itself is shot like a temple of modern capitalism, glass everywhere, polished marble, employees streaming in with ID cards swinging, the sound design mixing keyboard clacks with elevator chimes and distant laughter, and sitting at the top of this carefully constructed ecosystem is Arka Wijoya, played by Jeffrey Nicole, the cold, elusive CEO who's already become a meme on local social media for his icy stare and rumored brutal decision-making. Is the kind of character who, in a lesser movie, would be nothing more than a brooding cardboard cutout with great suits and a haunted backstory, but here the film takes its time letting us see him before we truly meet him. At first, we just get glimpses, a reflection in the elevator doors as he walks past a group of nervous employees, a silhouette behind frosted glass doors, a profile shot from the side as he stares at a stock price graph that's bleeding red, while everyone around him panics. His presence is built like an urban legend inside the movie itself, pass between interns and secretaries in whispered hallway gossip. Of course, as the title suggests, this CEO is going to be connected to something miraculous in Naya's life, but the way the film actually stages that intersection is surprisingly intimate and small rather than grand. Their first meeting is not in a boardroom, not in some dramatic elevator stuck between floors, but in a quiet emergency stairwell where Naya is hiding after a disastrous first presentation, trying and failing to stop herself from crying. The movie has this gorgeous shot where the fluorescent light above flickers, and we only see half of Naya's face as she struggles to breathe, her mascara starting to run, and then a shadow interrupts the light, and a hand appears in frame, offering her a simple packet of tissues. She takes it without looking up, mutters a thank you, and starts rambling nervously to this stranger about how she must look so unprofessional, how she messed everything up, how maybe she wasn't meant for a place like this, and the man just stands there, silent, until the camera finally tilts up and we see Arka for the first time, clearly, looking more curious than annoyed, clearly not used to hearing this kind of unfiltered vulnerability in his stairwell. That's their human level, grounded first contact, and it's important, because the miracle hasn't happened yet. At this point, they're just two people intersecting in a city of millions, a CEO and an intern sharing a moment that means much more to one of them than the other. The miracle comes later that same day, after Naya thinks everything is over. Her presentation goes from bad to worse, a data mishap makes it look like she manipulated numbers, she gets publicly scolded by a mid-level manager in front of the whole department, and by the time she steps out of the building, Jakarta has opened up into a full downpour, raindrops bouncing off the pavement like tiny explosions, traffic horns blaring underneath the roar of water. She stands under the building's awning, clutching the strap of her bag so tightly her knuckles turn white, and she just whispers under her breath, Tuhan, kalau memang bukan di sini jalanku, tolong kasih aku tanda, God, if this isn't my path, please give me a sign, and right on cue, because the movie is leaning into the magical realism rhythm, a street vendor nearby loses his grip on a box, spilling a cascade of small, colorful snow globes across the flooded sidewalk. One of them rolls toward Naya, stops at her foot, and the camera zooms in. Inside the cheap little globe is a miniature office building, complete with tiny windows lit up, and tiny, indistinct figures moving inside when she shakes it. It's obviously kitschy, probably mass-produced, but the way the film frames it, with the rain blurring everything else around them into a watercolor smear, makes it feel like an artifact from another world. Naya picks it up, the vendor tells her to keep it, and when her fingers close fully around it, time stops. Literally. Raindrops freeze in midair, cars halt mid-splash, a motorcycle hangs at an impossible angle, and you can actually hear the sudden absence of noise like someone sucked the sound out of the scene with a vacuum. The only things still moving are Naya and Arka, who's stepping out of the building, one hand raised to check his watch, and suddenly realizes that the entire city around them has been put on pause. The way the film handles his reaction is subtle. He doesn't scream, he doesn't immediately go into sci-fi logic panic, he just looks around with that same analytical intensity we saw in the boardroom, but for the first time, there's a crack of bewilderment, like an equation that refuses to balance. That's the core conceit of keajaibanku keajaibanku. Whenever Naya holds that particular snow globe and whispers a wish for help that is not purely selfish, time halts for everyone else, except for her and Arka, and they are pulled together into this little pocket of suspended reality where they can move through the frozen world, talk, argue, and, crucially, reconsider the choices they're about to make when time restarts. The film doesn't explain it with pseudoscience or a long-winded magical lore. Instead, it ties the miracle to Naya's childhood memory of a mysterious woman who once told her that every person only gets 3 real miracles in life, and you don't always recognize them when they arrive. This unexplained, faith-adjacent magic feels very Indonesian in its texture, a mix of folklore, quiet spirituality, and everyday superstition, sitting unobtrusively inside a hypermodern setting. As a reviewer, I found this to be one of the film's biggest strengths. It never feels the need to over-justify its magic, it just lets it exist, and because the emotional stakes and character work are strong, you go along with it. The early uses of the miracle are almost playful. In the first freeze frame, Naya and Arka walk through the raindrop-suspended street like kids in a museum exhibit, poking at droplets that wobble but don't fall, weaving between unmoving scooters, and the camera circles them with this weightless, steadicam glide while the score switches to a delicate mix of piano and a distant, echoing gamelan, like time itself has a heartbeat. Naya instinctively uses the moment to vent all the frustration she couldn't express in the real world, ranting to Arka about toxic offices and impossible expectations, and he listens, half incredulous, half amused, insisting this has to be some kind of elaborate hallucination, his logical brain running out of ways to explain it. The chemistry between Prilly Latuconsina and Jeffrey Nicole is surprisingly grounded for a story this high concept. Their banter feels like two people who fundamentally see the world differently trying, against their better judgment, to meet in the middle. Slowly, the miracle becomes less about spectacle and more a device to dig into their psyches. Every time something major is about to go wrong in the company, a round of layoffs, a PR disaster, an unethical deal, Naya's desperation triggers the snow globe again, and she and Arka are thrown into another pocket of stop time where they can walk the halls of Halloween, pause over colleagues who are mid-laugh or mid-tear, and talk about what it all means. In one of the most affecting sequences, they step into the office floor and see Riska, a single mother and one of Naya's closest colleagues, frozen with an unread layoff email open on her screen. Naya instinctively moves to close the laptop or delete the email, but Arka stops her, and they argue in hushed tones even though no one can hear them. Naya accusing him of treating people like numbers and Arka firing back that companies don't survive on feelings. The cinematography here is intimate, tight shots of their faces, then wide shots of the still office, ceiling lights casting sterile pools of white on an unmoving sea of humanity, and as they fight, you can feel that this is less about one email and more about their clashing philosophies. Naya believes in small kindnesses as miracles, Arka believes in big, painful decisions as necessary evils. The miracle drops them into a series of moral debates, and each one peels another layer off their personas. Jeffrey Nicole plays Arka with a real sense of restraint. You can see the exhaustion behind his eyes, the trauma of having inherited the company from a father who died of a heart attack right after a major financial crisis, the survivor's guilt that makes him double down on control and perfectionism. We get brief flashbacks, tinted slightly warmer, of a younger Arka helping his father sweep the dusty floor of the company's very first warehouse, of a promise made over styrofoam coffee cups that he would never let Halloween die, and those images haunt his choices in the present. Naya, on the other hand, carries the weight of her family's hope. And Prilly gives her this blend of stubborn optimism and crushing insecurity that feels painfully real in a world where everyone's told they can be anything, but also reminded daily that they're replaceable. In the frozen pockets of time, away from the noise of colleagues and investors, they start telling each other things they can't admit when the clock is ticking: fears, grief, regrets. One quiet scene has them standing on the rooftop, the city below them caught mid-sparkle, and Arka finally admitting that he dreams of releasing it all, of selling the company and disappearing, but he feels trapped by the myth of his own success. It's in these moments that keajaibanku keajaibanku really transcends the template of a standard CEO romance. It becomes a meditation on what we owe the people who believe in us, and what we owe ourselves. From a cinematic standpoint, the film is doing some beautiful work with contrast. Whenever time freezes, the color grading leans gently into cooler blues and desaturated tones, emphasizing the surreal stillness, while the sound mix drops almost all environmental noise, letting the score and the characters' voices dominate. When time resumes, everything rushes back at once: traffic, chatter, the hum of air conditioning, and both Naya and Arka flinch slightly each time, as if re-entering the normal's world is more jarring than leaving it. This contrast cleverly supports the emotional theme that their most honest, vulnerable selves only come out in the impossible spaces, the pauses between obligations. Thematically, the movie keeps circling this idea: miracles are not grand events that erase your problems, they are small windows of clarity in which you're forced to choose who you're going to be when the world starts moving again. And the script doesn't let that idea off easy, it pushes it all the way into the third act, to some fairly heavy places. Without getting too deep into spoiler territory, because I think some of the plot turns are worth discovering fresh, I'll say this: the miracle is not permanent, and the movie signals that from the beginning with that 3 miracles in a lifetime folklore line. Naya and Arka learn, through a chilling, beautifully executed scene involving a frozen hospital corridor and the echo of a childhood prayer, that every use of the snow globe carries a price, not in some cheap transactional magic way, but in terms of consequences they can't fully predict. There's a point where Arka, desperate to fix a massive scandal threatening to destroy Halloween and harm thousands of employees, tries to force the miracle, gripping the snow globe with white-knuckled intensity and whispering wishes that are more about control than about help, and nothing happens. Time refuses to stop, meetings spiral out, investors demand answers, and we see him for the first time without the safety net of the miracle, nakedly panicked. It's a bold writing choice, because it yanks the story back into the realm of harsh reality right when you might be expecting an easy magical fix, and it's here that some viewers might feel the pacing drag a bit. The second half of the film lingers in the desperation and fallout, with long dialogue-heavy scenes of strategy and confession. Personally, I appreciated the choice. It made the eventual final use of the miracle feel like a genuine climax instead of a cheat. Speaking of pacing, if there's a legitimate critique to make, it's that the film occasionally leans too heavily on melodrama in the middle stretch. We get a few too many scenes of Naya watching her phone screen light up with calls from home she's too guilty to answer, while sad pop ballads swell in the background, and some of the corporate intrigue subplots, corrupt board members, leaked internal memos, never quite escape cliché territory. But the performances keep it afloat. Prilly carries the emotional core with a kind of raw, unpolished sincerity. She never feels like she's playing a plucky heroine. She feels like your friend who updates her Instagram story from a cramped bus, makes jokes about being broke, and then quietly sends half her paycheck home. Her body language shifts over the course of the film from hunched and apologetic to quietly grounded, especially in the way she starts to stand in rooms with superiors, and that arc is mirrored in how she uses the miracle. At first she wishes for small, immediate escapes, please, just let this presentation not happen, and by the end, her wishes turn outward, focused on other people's futures. Jeffrey's Arca is a great foil. His transformation is subtler, less of a 180-degree personality flip and more of a gradual uncoiling of someone who's been clenched tight for years. The film smartly avoids the trope of having love fix him. Instead, it suggests that love, in the form of Naya's stubborn insistence that he's more than his role, simply creates enough space and safety for him to finally confront parts of himself he's been compartmentalizing. There's a scene that exemplifies this so well. Time has stopped. They are sitting cross-legged on the office floor between rows of empty desks, eating instant noodles they grabbed from the pantry, the steam spiraling up into the frozen air. Arca, in a soft, almost embarrassed tone, admits that as a kid he once prayed for his father to fail, just so he'd have more time to play with him, and then his father's heart attack happened a few months later. That confession, delivered so quietly you almost lean in to hear it, reframes his entire harsh persona, and the way Naya reacts, not with a grand speech, but by simply sharing her own worst, pettiest prayer from childhood, creates one of the most human exchanges in the movie. On a technical level, keajaibanku does something interesting with Jakarta itself. It treats the city as both antagonist and accomplice. The traffic, the endless rainstorms, the cramped public spaces, the constant construction, these are not just background texture, they're woven into the emotional beats. When Naya feels trapped, the camera goes handheld on crowded buses, faces pressing in, horns blaring, billboards screaming about success. When she's in a miracle pocket with Arca, the city is vast but silent, highways empty, billboards frozen, like the city is holding its breath and watching them. For viewers outside Indonesia, this is a glimpse into a very specific urban rhythm, but the feelings will be universal for anyone who's ever chased a dream in a big, indifferent metropolis. The soundtrack deserves a mention too. Instead of generic pop tracks, the film alternates between indie Indonesian artists and an original score that leans heavily on soft piano, ambient synth, and traditional instruments used sparingly, almost like memories surfacing in the music. There's a recurring motif, 3 descending notes on a siren, that appears every time the miracle is about to trigger, not in a flashy way but like a subtle, sonic watermark, quietly training your subconscious to anticipate the freeze. By the time we reach the climax, where that motif plays in a stripped-down, almost a cappella form over a crucial choice Naya has to make, it hits you with the weight of everything you've seen so far. In terms of themes, the movie is juggling several as miracles as choices, work as identity, the burden of being gifted with opportunity in a country where many are not, the ways capitalism can hollow out even the best intentions, and, underneath it all, a soft but persistent question about faith, faith in God, in fate, in each other. The script never gets preachy. When characters pray, they do so the way people actually do in real life, hurriedly, nervously, in stairwells, on buses, in their heads while pretending to be composed. The miracle isn't framed as a religious reward, more like a mysterious, undeserved grace that neither of them fully understands. One of the movie's most poignant lines comes when an older janitor, who's always humming old dangdut songs in the background, tells Naya without knowing anything about the miracle, "Kadang keajaiban itu bukan sesuatu yang datang dari langit, tapi orang yang tiba-tiba berani juga sama kita," which roughly means, sometimes a miracle isn't something that falls from the sky, it's the person who suddenly dares to be honest with us. That line is practically the thesis statement of the whole film, because in the end, the real miracle between Naya and Arka isn't that they can stop time, it's that they start telling the truth, to themselves and to each other, in a world that constantly encourages them to perform. Audience reaction to the keajaibanku keajaibanku has been fascinating to watch. In Indonesia, especially among younger viewers, it sparked a flurry of TikTok edits and Twitter threads dissecting every freeze frame, every look Jeffrey gives Prilly, every small prop that might be a symbol. People started sharing their own miracle moments at work, times when a boss showed unexpected kindness, or when a small decision altered the course of a career, and tagging them with the film's hashtag. At the same time, there were conversations about the ethics of romanticizing a boss-employee relationship, even one that's handled with as much care as this. Some critics worried that it might send the wrong message about tolerating toxicity in the workplace in the hope that a miracle CEO will suddenly reveal a heart of gold. The movie partially anticipates this critique. It doesn't absolve Arka easily, and it makes sure that Naya's growth involves gaining the confidence to confront him, to draw boundaries, and, importantly, to make a choice about her own career that isn't entirely centered on him. Without spoiling the precise nature of that choice, I will say that the ending is bittersweet in a way that feels honest. The miracle doesn't fix everything, the company doesn't magically become an ethical utopia overnight, and love doesn't erase the scars of past decisions, but there's a sense of forward motion, of small, stubborn hope. From a cultural impact perspective, keajaibanku keajaibanku fits into a broader wave of Asian romantic dramas that blend fantasy with workplace settings. Think of shows like It's Okay to Not Be Okay, or Two Worlds, but filtered through a very specific Indonesian corporate and religious context, but its emphasis on small miracles and everyday faith gives it a distinct flavor. It also arrives at a moment when many people, post-pandemic and mid-economic uncertainty, are questioning the meaning of their jobs and the price of ambition, and so watching characters literally step outside of time to question their priorities hits a nerve. Personally, as I watched the credits roll over that final, lingering shot of the now-still snow globe sitting on Naya's desk, sunlight streaming through the office windows instead of rain for the first time, papers fluttering in a gentle, normal breeze instead of suspended midair, I felt that ache you get when a story has walked you right up to the edge of magical wish fulfillment and then gently turned you back toward reality with just enough warmth that you don't resent it. Keajaibanku keajaibanku is not a perfect film. Its middle act stumbles, a couple of side characters, like a comic relief co-worker and a rival executive, remain more archetypes than fully realized people, and there are moments when the dialogue gets a little too on the nose with its life lessons, but it is an earnest, lovingly crafted, visually thoughtful piece of cinema that dares to suggest that in a world obsessed with hustle and grind, a real miracle might just be the moment someone in power looks at you, really looks at you, and decides to change, even a little. If you're the kind of viewer who loves clean, hyper-realistic narratives, the unexplained magic might frustrate you if you crave tight If you tilt keajaibanku just a few degrees and squint at it from another side, it stops feeling like a swoony office romance with a miracle twist and starts looking like a really quiet, almost unsettling story about power, responsibility, and what it actually means when time only stops for the people at the top. And that's the angle I want to dive into this time. Because beneath all the soft lighting and frozen raindrops there's a darker question pulsing under the surface. What happens when a CEO gets the literal power to pause the world, and who gets left out of that miracle circle every single time? The more I sit with the film, the more that snow globe starts to feel less like a cute fantastical object and more like a metaphor for privilege, for how certain people move through life in their own slowed-down bubble while everyone else is stuck in real time, dealing with the consequences. Think about it. From the moment Naya realizes the globe works and discovers that Arka can move in the freeze with her, the movie is quietly setting up a hierarchy of who is allowed inside the miracle and who isn't. Naya and Arka roam the office floors while everyone else, Riska at her desk, the janitor mopping, the interns hovering near the coffee machine, are literally frozen mid-breath, mid-blink, turned into silent scenery in someone else's moral debate, and the film invites us to feel the intimacy of their conversations. But if you step back for a second, it also invites a little discomfort, because there's something eerie about watching a CEO and an intern walk through a suspended office and decide, essentially, how other people's lives are going to play out once the clock restarts. From that perspective, keajaibanku starts to resemble a kind of ethical fantasy where the magic doesn't liberate the powerless as much as it intensifies the dilemma of the powerful. Arka can see the structural harm of his decisions more clearly now, the frozen faces, the paused tears, and he can debate them with Naya, yet in most cases, when time resumes, he still pulls the same levers, because the film insists on staying grounded in a version of corporate reality where not every hard choice can be magicked away. You could argue that this makes the film weirdly conservative, but I think what Ramaditya is doing as a director is something trickier. He's using fantasy not to indulge our escapist fantasies about if I could stop time, I'd save everyone, but to expose how entangled we are in systems that keep pushing us back into the same patterns even after moments of radical clarity. This is where the adaptation angle gets really interesting, because in the original Wattpad novel by Nadia Parameter, yes, I did the thing and went back to read key chapters after watching, the miracle was more explicitly framed as a romantic destiny device, this fated connection between Naya and Arka, almost like some cosmic force shipping them together. The book still had social commentary, but it leaned harder into the idea that they were chosen for each other. The film deliberately walks some of that back. It keeps the chemistry and the magical intimacy, but it introduces that only 3 real miracles rule and layers in more scenes of corporate fallout, of Riska, of the older janitor, of the anonymous workers on the warehouse floor, so that the miracle feels less like a Cupid's arrow and more like a moral spotlight. That choice changes everything about how we read Arka as a character. Jeffrey Nichols' CEO isn't just a brooding love interest anymore, he's a man who's being forcibly given front-row seats to the collateral damage of his own leadership. The stairwell arguments, the noodle-on-the-floor confession, the rooftop dreams of escape, those scenes aren't just there to make you ship them harder, they're there to underline the fact that miracles, in this story's universe, are uncomfortable. They drag the ugliest, smallest prayers out of you and make you look at them in harsh fluorescent light. Viewed from this angle, some of the film's most romantic imagery starts to feel double-edged. Take that iconic freeze in the rain where Naya's prayer for a sign brings the snow globe rolling to her foot. Visually, it's gorgeous, the kind of scene that ends up on posters and fan edits, but it's also, if you think about it, a moment where desperation is rewarded not with an escape, but with a heavier burden. She doesn't get a miracle that finds her a new dream job or miraculously heals her mother. Instead, she gets a tool that locks her even more tightly to the company and to Arka, a connection that will force her to be present for every ugly meeting, every layoff, every scandal. Relentless pacing, the film's reflective pauses might feel slow. But if you've ever sat at your desk late at night, cursor blinking on an unfinished resignation letter, and wished the world would just freeze for a minute so you could catch your breath and figure out who you are beyond your employee ID, this movie will feel like someone reaching out from the screen and quietly saying, "I know." And isn't that, in its own way, a miracle of cinema, to be seen so precisely by a story that came from halfway around the world? So as I think back on Naya standing in that rain, Arka clutching that snow globe like a lifeline, the city of Jakarta shimmering around them caught between motion and stillness, I find myself grateful that stories like this exist, stories that remind us that we don't need time to literally stop in order to ask better questions about our lives. Sometimes we just need to pause a video, set our phones down, and sit with what we're feeling. Keajaibanku gives us that pause in narrative form and then sends us back into the rush with a slightly softer heart. And as this review comes to an end, I'll leave you with the same kind of question the film leaves with its characters. Whether she wants that knowledge or not. The miracle expands her agency in one way. She now has this secret space where she can speak freely, question things, even influence some outcomes, but it also narrows her world, because once you've walked those halls in stillness and seen the fear on people's faces, how do you go back to being just another intern silently updating spreadsheets? The film doesn't hand her an easy answer, and that's where the discomfort creeps in. She starts to become complicit, not in a villainous way, but in the very human way that anyone who stays in a flawed system long enough becomes woven into it, even if they came in as the idealistic outsider. One of the subtlest choices the film makes, and this is where the direction and editing really shine, is how often Naya and Arka stand literally above the frozen workers when they're in the miracle, on the balcony overlooking the open-plan office, on that rooftop with the city beneath them, in the glass-walled executive suites gazing down into the lobby. Those top-down shots aren't accidental, they're visual reminders of the structural hierarchy. Even in a paused universe where everyone is equal in their stillness, some bodies are more visible, more centered. When Naya first realizes they can walk around in the freeze, she runs to the intern desk, almost instinctively, to check on her friends, but as the story goes on, those first steps when the miracle hits tend to take her more and more towards Arka's office, towards that where is he, what's his reaction, what are we going to decide this time center of gravity. You could read that as standard romance plotting, and on one level it is, but if you're looking from this other angle, it also reads as something a little sadder, the slow gravitational pull of power, even on someone who came in just wanting to send money back home. There's a scene late in the film, one that doesn't get talked about as much as the big hospital corridor or the rooftop confession, where the miracle snaps on right in the middle of an all-hands meeting. Everyone is frozen mid-clap, mid-photo for the company's anniversary, faces plastered with those polite, half-sincere smiles you put on for corporate events. Naya walks through the crowd, fingers brushing ID lanyards, catching snippets of paused expressions that tell their own stories, boredom, frustration, genuine pride, quiet anxiety. Arka is off to one side of the stage, hand raised mid-wave, and they end up standing there among all these suspended bodies, arguing in low voices about a merger decision that will fundamentally change the company. What struck me re-watching that scene from this critical angle is how neither of them ever goes up to the mic, never stands where the speeches are made, despite having the literal power to control the flow of time. They just hover in the crowd, as if they're unable to fully step into the role of overt authors of fate, yet they still walk out of the frozen room knowing the merger will go through when time resumes. That tension, between what they could do in the miracle and what they choose not to do, is where the film's quiet critique lives. The snow globe is the fantasy we all secretly have about our bosses, that if they just had a little more time, a little more perspective, a little more insight into our lives, they would make kinder choices. Keajaibanku grants that fantasy, gives the boss infinite pauses, personal tours through his employees' frozen moments, and then still makes him choose cutbacks, restructuring, tough calls. That's not the film endorsing cruelty, it's the film saying, even when you can see the humanity of the people beneath you, you can still feel trapped enough by the logic of the system to harm them. In a weird way, that makes Arka more tragic and less romanticized, and Jeffrey Nicole leans into that, especially in the later free scenes where he's noticeably more subdued, shoulders tighter, glances to Naya tinged with something like shame. On the other side of this ethical coin is the question of who never gets access to the miracle at all, and that's where Riska and the janitor come back into focus, not just as supporting characters but as people whose lives are profoundly affected by decisions made in rooms they'll never see. When Naya and Arka stand over Riska's open layoff email and debate whether there's another solution, the film is pushing us to think about all the times in real life when similar debates happen without any sort of miracle, when workers' livelihoods are bullet points on PowerPoint slides. The miracle in the film, then, becomes a storytelling tool to externalize those debates. To make visible the invisible, and that's powerful, but it also raises this unsettling side question: if the miracle never extended beyond those in power, how many miracles in our world are happening right now that we simply don't see because we're not in the right rooms? This angle also reshapes how we read the film's religious and spiritual subtext. Those quick, breathless prayers Naya sends up, on the bus, in the rain, at her cost window before a big day, don't result in divine intervention that lifts her out of the system, they result in a miracle that binds her more tightly to it, but with eyes wide open. It's almost like the film is gently critiquing the way faith sometimes gets co-opted to help us endure systems instead of dismantling them. The older janitor's line about miracles being people who dare to be honest becomes even more loaded in this context, because honesty in keajaibanku is a double-edged sword. Naya's honesty with Arka in the freeze world transforms him, yes, softens him, nudges the company in slightly more humane directions, but that same honesty also locks her into a position where she feels responsible for him, for his betterment, which is a burden women in the workplace are all too familiar with. That's another angle this film opens up if you let it, the gendered labor of emotional caretaking. Naya, the small-town intern with the heart of gold, ends up doing what so many women do. She becomes her powerful male boss's conscience, therapist, emotional translator, all while still worrying about her own job security and her family's finances. The movie is very romantic about this. It shows long, dreamy shots of them in frozen cafes, in empty trains, in silent streets, bearing their souls. But if you map that onto real-world patterns, it's hard not to notice the imbalance. Arka gets to have his big catharsis, his breakdown about his father, his fear of failure. Naya holds that space for him, gently, compassionately, even when she's drowning herself. The script is self-aware enough to poke at this dynamic. There are moments where her friends tease her about fixing her boss, moments where even she rolls her eyes at his brooding, but the fantasy is still seductive. What if your miraculous calling in life is to be the one person who understands the misunderstood genius in the corner office? It's romantic, yes, it's also a storyline that conveniently assigns the heavy lifting of moral repair to the least powerful person in the room. If you watch the film with this in mind, those miracle scenes begin to feel like unpaid emotional labor cranked up to a mythic scale. Now, does the movie critique that or reinforce it? I think it does a bit of both. On one hand, it clearly sees Naya's nurturing, empathetic presence as heroic. On the other, it gives her just enough agency in the final act, especially in that last big choice she makes about her own future, to suggest that she is not defined by Arka's redemption arc. There's a moment when she stands in the HR office, real-time ticking, no miracle to hide in, and calmly states what role she wants, what terms she needs, and the camera frames her alone, no Arka in sight, no snow globe. Just Naya and her voice. That's the film quietly pushing back against its own trope, saying, yes, she helped save him from himself, but she will not chain herself to that job forever. If we pivot to the craft from this more critical vantage point, the cinematography's obsession with glass and reflection starts to look less like just an aesthetic choice and more like a thematic one. So many key miracle scenes happen near windows, in lobbies with glass walls, in conference rooms where the characters' reflections float over the cityscape. It's as if the movie is constantly reminding us that these characters are living inside transparent boxes, that their choices are visible, scrutinized, echoed. When time freezes, those reflections sharpen, the glass becomes almost a second skin, holding their mirrored selves in place while their bodies move freely. In one particularly striking composition, Naya and Arka argue in front of a floor-to-ceiling window, and the camera slowly pushes in on their reflections rather than on their actual faces, blurring the line between who they are and who they perceive themselves to be. If you're thinking about the film as an interrogation of power and complicity, that visual motif lands even harder. Nobody in this system gets to pretend they're not part of the picture, their image is always there, doubled, watching. The sound design, too, takes on a different tenor from this angle. The absence of ambient noise in the freeze world that feels so calming at first, relief from Jakarta's chaos, starts to sound a little suffocating when you realize who gets to inhabit that silence. For Arka, used to constant pressure, the miracle's quiet is a rare space where he can let his mask slip. That much is clear, but there are moments, especially later on, where the hush becomes oppressive, where you can feel Naya craving the messy, loud reality of her co-workers around her, because in the freeze, she's trapped one-on-one with a man whose every confession pulls her deeper into his orbit. The score leans into this duality. The same piano motif that felt like wonder in the early miracle scene starts, by repetition, to carry a hint of melancholy, even dread, as if the music itself is questioning whether stopping time is still a blessing. One of my favorite small directorial choices that plays into this revised reading happens in a blink-and-you-miss-it shot, in a late miracle sequence. As Naya and Arka walk through the warehouse, the camera briefly lingers not on them, but on the frozen clock on the wall, its second hand caught right between ticks. The shot is held just a fraction of a second longer than you expect, long enough to plant a discomforting thought. If someone hit pause on your life right now, mid-shift, mid-worry, mid-dream, who would be wandering past your frozen body deciding what comes next? The fact that keajaibanku even nudges us toward questions like that is what keeps it from being just another shiny romance in my mind. It's still lush, still dreamy, still full of fan service moments tailored for people who want to save the skin-crawling analysis for later, but once you've seen it, it's hard to unsee the underlying critique. Suddenly that last shot of the snow globe on Naya's desk doesn't just say, "Look, the magic is over, life goes on." It also says, "This thing sat here the whole time, shaping choices you'll never fully understand." And maybe that's the most honest thing the movie does. It admits that for most people in most systems, miracles, whether they're lucky breaks, sympathetic bosses, or literal time-stopping snow globes, are things that happen to other people, behind glass, while you keep typing. That sounds bleak, but the film, to its credit, doesn't leave us there. It keeps circling back to the idea that the one miracle everyone has access to is the ability to tell the truth, to themselves and to each other, in whatever little slivers of pause they can carve out of the day. You don't need a snow globe to step outside, take a breath, and say, "This isn't working," or "I'm scared," or "I want something different." Naya's greatest act of defiance isn't when she triggers the miracle, it's when she looks Arka in the eye in a perfectly ordinary moment, time running just as it always does, and tells him, without magic, what she will and won't sacrifice. In that sense, keajaibanku manages a neat, complicated trick. It uses fantasy to lure us in, then uses the discomfort that fantasy generates to push us back toward the very fantastical, very messy work of making ethical choices in jobs, relationships, and systems that won't ever stop for us. Watch it once for the romance, for the chemistry, for the rain and the city lights. Watch it again from this angle, and see if that silence in the miracle scene still feels as gentle, or if there's a new little knot in your stomach when the world freezes and only the CEO and the girl with everything to lose are left standing. And as we sit with that, with the snow globe on the desk and the clock on the wall and the question of who gets to pause and who doesn't, I'll ask you the same thing this film keeps asking in different words. When your own tiny miracles show up, are they pulling you deeper into someone else's story, or finally giving you space to write your own? The very first time I saw the title keajaibanku, I laughed quietly at how grand yet personal it sounded, like an impossible collision between boardroom ambition and fairy tale wonder. And as I pressed play on the first episode of this new Indonesian series, dubbed for Chinese audiences and then rippling out to a global crowd online, I could already feel that I was stepping into something that promised both glamour and sincerity, the strange magic of a world that worships power but still yearns for tenderness. Before we continue, please subscribe to my channel Scenecraft Review, and let us know where you are listening from in the comments. Released in the spring of 2025, right when streaming platforms were gasping for something warm after a long wave of dystopian thrillers, keajaibanku arrived with the energy of a sunrise after rain. Directed by a daring new filmmaker from Jakarta who had spent years working in advertising, the series feels almost like a dream where neon lights melt into morning mist, where redemption grows silently underneath all the noise of luxury brands and sleek offices. The premise seems simple on paper. A cold, efficient young CEO named Adrian Kuzuma rules over a tech conglomerate so vast it practically owns the digital heartbeat of the country, until one day he meets a woman named Miani, a small-town barista with an inexplicable ability to bring broken things, and broken people, back to life. But the show doesn't market this outright as fantasy. It hides its miracles under the subtle folds of everyday life, a wilted flower that blooms again after her touch, a severed friendship mended after a chance conversation she initiates. Her miracle, in truth, might not be supernatural at all. It's the contagious sincerity in her eyes, the thing that no algorithm can quantify. The narrative structure cleverly mirrors Adrian's emotional disintegration, his gradual realization that his success, his luxury apartment above the skyline, and his meticulously ironed suits cannot insulate him from the emptiness that has grown where his soul used to reside. Scene after scene, the cinematography lingers on reflections, windows, puddles, mirrors, showing us how the world sees him versus how he sees himself, and by the third episode, when he finds himself returning to Mirani's tiny cafe, by coincidence for the fifth time, we already know his transformation has begun even if he doesn't. What struck me most as I watched was how confident the direction feels, the color grading glows warm, the pacing moves like a gentle heartbeat, and the dialogue, though translated for the dubbed Chinese version, retains its Indonesian rhythm, those melodic inflections that make the mundane sound poetic. The chemistry between Adrian and Mirani grows quietly. There's an almost vintage restraint in how they look at each other, like they both know that love, if it truly comes, should unfold slowly, through acts of care rather than declarations. In episode 6, there's a moment when Adrian watches her fix a child's broken music box, and you can literally see his world tilt. The camera shifts from a crisp, corporate composition to something handheld and soft-focused, as if reality itself blurs under the weight of emotion. It's beautiful, frustratingly beautiful, because it captures what the series keeps whispering, that real transformation isn't loud, it's quiet, almost unseen, until it's undeniable. The performances carry everything. Adrian's actor plays arrogance and vulnerability with precision, his eyes darting like a man who spent too long inside polished glass, while Mirani's actress uses silence as her weapon. She smiles like someone remembering a secret, turning every conversation into a parable. What I find impressive is the show's refusal to become just another rich man meets poor girl cliché. Instead, it reframes the trope through the idea of miracles. What if success itself is not an achievement but a responsibility? And what if love is the only true miracle we still misunderstand? Cinematically, the handheld shots in small spaces contrast the wide, symmetrical compositions of the corporate world, giving us a visual language of heart versus habit. The soundtrack complements it perfectly. Gentle piano themes hover beneath ambient street noises, and occasionally, when something profound happens, the score dissolves into pure human voices without words, like hope humming under the city's endless chatter. There's one unforgettable scene near the middle of the series. Adrian walks through a darkened street after losing a major deal, and he hears distant laughter. The cafe closed for renovation, but he swears he sees Mirani under the streetlight, barefoot, painting on the wall with nothing but rainwater. He joins her silently, tracing her movements until dawn breaks. It's metaphorical, yes, but also intimate and real, representing a man dissolving his identity into humility. The series doesn't race toward romantic confession, instead, it tiptoes around spiritual awakening. Each episode adds another shade of meaning, until you realize the miracle of the title might belong to both characters, Mirani's gift to heal others, and Adrian's gift to finally see life as something more than a quarterly report. What makes keajaibanku emotionally magnetic is how universal it feels. Though the setting is Indonesian, every viewer can find themselves somewhere inside that struggle between ambition and humanity. The show's pacing, often considered slow by impatient viewers, is actually deliberate. It grants us time to breathe between emotional punches. By holding on to silences, it invites introspection. Many modern dramas rush to deliver plot twists. This one trusts that an honest gaze or a hesitant hand can be more thrilling than an explosion. I won't spoil the final episode, but I will say it leaves you both satisfied and haunted. The ending asks what happens when someone's miracle changes not only the people around them but the very definition of who they are. There's a choice, heartbreaking in its simplicity, that redefines what love means in a world obsessed with winning. From a cultural perspective, keajaibanku represents an exciting shift in Southeast Asian storytelling, a confidence to merge local sentimentality with international polish. The Chinese dub manages to preserve much of that tenderness, though some idioms lose their exact flavor, the emotional truth stays intact. And surprisingly, the international fans embraced the dubbed version, flooding forums with discussions about the moral metaphors hidden in dialogue. I've seen essays analyzing Mirani's miracle as a metaphor for empathy in modern capitalism, and others arguing that Adrian's downfall mirrors Indonesia's rapid economic transformation. Whether or not you agree with those readings, it's undeniable that the series sparked conversations beyond its expected demographic. It became a trending topic across multiple regions not because of flashy marketing but because it touched something raw, a longing for authenticity in a manufactured world. And isn't that what miracles are, after all? When something real sneaks into a landscape made of illusion. Watching it, I felt like the compassionate tone of Indonesian dramas finally found a global bridge. The creators dared to mix linguistic identities, emotional pacing, and cultural codes, resulting in something quietly revolutionary. The cinematography also deserves credit for its painterly style, scenes framed through doorways, reflections in latte foam, light passing through bus windows, all serve as metaphors for seeing versus being seen. You can almost feel the humidity of Jakarta's air pressing against the camera lens, making the city itself breathe along with the characters. That sensory realism is what allows the few overtly magical moments, like a flower blooming or a shattered phone repairing itself briefly in Mirani's hands, to feel earned rather than cliché. And the acting choices reinforce this subtlety. Adrian's posture shifts gradually through the series, from rigid dominance to open vulnerability, and by the finale, even the way he walks tells his story. Mirani's arc, on the other hand, suggests that miracles can be burdensome. She begins radiant but grows weary under the weight of expectation, echoing the universal truth that being special often means being misunderstood. Together, they form a kind of emotional symphony that plays softly but relentlessly in the background of your mind long after the credits roll. What I appreciate most is that the show doesn't mock ambition, it questions its cost. It doesn't romanticize poverty, it humanizes dignity. It argues, gently yet firmly, that connection may be the only real wealth. As viewers, we are seduced by the lavish office scenery, the designer suits, and the skyline drone shots, but the deeper we go, the more we sense how fragile those symbols are. One of the most heart-stopping moments occurs when Adrian, having finally realized the emptiness of his empire, deletes his own company logo from the skyscraper lights, plunging the city's night into sudden darkness and whispering, "Let them sleep." It's poetic, almost mythic, and the lighting team deserves applause for turning a corporate act of rebellion into visual transcendence. Fans online later dubbed it the Night of Silence, and it spread as a meme representing personal liberation. That's what powerful storytelling does, it finds its way into your everyday metaphors. The series also excels at balancing melodrama with humor. The secondary characters, Adrian's quirky assistant and Mirani's no-nonsense grandmother, deliver lines that not only lighten the narrative but expose its heart. They remind us that miracles often need witnesses, that even in grand transformations, someone has to crack a joke to keep us grounded. By episode 10, the series adds another layer, nostalgia. We learn about Adrian's childhood, a rural boy dreaming of shining buildings, and about Mirani's late father, a doctor who believed that healers exist in every profession, even entrepreneurs. These backstories reassemble the puzzle of their fates and make their connection feel cosmic rather than coincidental. There's a thematic thread about inherited pain and chosen healing, that perhaps the miracle we crave outside is already inside us. Technically, the editing rhythm amplifies this insight. Cross-cuts between boardroom negotiations and family flashbacks force us to compare emotional currencies. This stylistic coherence between theme and technique gives the series its cinematic weight, something rarely achieved in television form. The director's choice to shoot with long takes was risky but rewarding, especially in sentimental scenes where the camera lingers on trembling hands instead of quick cuts. Every small gesture matters. And that's precisely what the show is about, noticing the small miracles. Watching the online reaction was heartwarming. Fans from Indonesia, China, and even Latin America posted reaction videos tearing up over the same quotes translated into different tongues, proving emotion truly transcends language. Critics, too, praised the authenticity of the performances and the unhurried tone, calling it a new model of Asian romantic realism. For me, personally, it reaffirmed why we watch stories at all, because they remind us that somewhere out there, another soul is wrestling with the same doubts dressed in different costumes. When the finale's credits rolled, accompanied by the soft chime of a music box, I sat quietly, letting tears blur the screen, not because it was sad but because it was complete. Keajaibanku doesn't just ask whether miracles exist, it shows that they can look like kindness in a world too busy for it. It left me thinking about how often we confuse control with purpose, and how sometimes letting go is the most courageous decision a person can make. The show's title itself, translated roughly as My CEO, My Miracle, suddenly gains new weight. Maybe we're all CEOs of the tiny empires we build around ourselves, and maybe the miracle is learning how to dismantle them lovingly. That's the message that stays with you into the night. And as someone who spends hours reviewing films and series, I find that this one reached through my cynicism and touched something simpler, the desire to believe again. Keajaibanku may not have dragons or epic battles, but it battles something fiercer, the loneliness of modern life. And in doing so, it wins. Imagine starting keajaibanku not as a love story, but as a fable about control, about a man addicted to order in a world built on chaos, and suddenly the same scenes take on an entirely different meaning, bursting with quiet irony and bittersweet laughter that you didn't notice the first time, because while the surface glitters with romance, underneath runs a study of obsession, ego, and the miracle of surrender, the idea that letting go is the bravest act of all, the unspoken thesis of the series hiding behind its boardroom sparkle. Before we continue, please subscribe to my channel Scenecraft Review, and let us know where you are listening from in the comments. So here's the twist in perspective. What if Mirani isn't the miracle itself, but the mirror that forces Adrian to confront his own blindness, a walking embodiment of chaos disguised as kindness, teaching him that control is a cage polished until it looks like clarity. Every scene where she defies his instructions, every unpredictable smile, becomes an act of rebellion against the false certainty of numbers. And suddenly the series morphs from soft melodrama to philosophical satire. Watch how the camera collaborates with that subtext. Notice how the corporate offices are always shot in symmetrical lines, rigid and sterile, while Mirani's cafe is filmed through mismatched glass panes, light leaking from every angle, reminding us that imperfection is the soul of life, that design choice isn't accidental, it's the heartbeat of the narrative. Through this lens, keajaibanku becomes not a traditional romance but a meditation on systems, business systems, emotional systems, even cultural systems, testing how far human warmth can stretch inside the grid of modern expectation. When the Chinese dub translates certain Indonesian idioms into more formal Mandarin phrases, the conflict of systems becomes linguistic too, a battle between directness and delicacy, efficiency and empathy. There's an extraordinary sequence near the midpoint that feels different on rewatch, the staff meeting meltdown, where Adrian chastises his team for missing deadlines, only to lose his voice mid-sentence. At first it seemed symbolic of stress, but under the control versus chaos interpretation, it becomes cosmic irony, the universe literally silencing arrogance. Mirani's quiet act of pouring him tea before she leaves the room says more than any apology could. The director frames this not as humiliation but liberation, and that's where the satirical brilliance hides, in showing that authority without vulnerability is just fear in a tailored suit. Another new angle emerges when you view the series as commentary on globalization itself. After all, it's an Indonesian drama dressed in Chinese doublins, streaming through Western platforms, a metaphor for how individual identity gets translated, softened, and occasionally lost in the machinery of cross-cultural exchange. Exactly what happens to Adrian as he becomes fluent in the language of profit but illiterate in the grammar of compassion. Each translation, like the dub itself, sacrifices something but also creates accidental poetry, the kind that thrives on misunderstanding. The editing supports this. The jump cuts between local street markets and the sterile glass towers of the tech world feel like borders colliding, producing beauty and tension at once. Watch the subtle humor here. Mirani teaches Adrian to smile not from politeness but from presence, to actually mean it. It's such a simple motif that by episode 9, when he finally laughs freely for the first time, it's thunderous, the sound of pure release. The show's tone, recast from this philosophical angle, balances critique with compassion. It scolds gently, as if saying, yes, you built your empire, but did you ever build a moment that made you feel alive? Viewed this way, the supporting characters evolve into something akin to a Greek chorus, each representing a facet of modern identity, the assistant clinging to productivity apps as a replacement for prayer, the board member preaching flexibility while terrified of change, the grandmother who sees through everyone's illusions with mischief and peppermint candy. They are all fragments of one psyche, our psyche, showing us that miracles don't appear from heavens but from fractures, from the tiny hairline cracks that appear when control begins to crumble. At its core, keajaibanku is a parable for our digital age. A CEO with all the world's data still cannot predict the wonders of genuine connection, and the miracle is simply this, human unpredictability. The cinematography itself rebels, breaking continuity rules, mismatching lighting on purpose, shaking the camera just enough to feel human hands behind it, an aesthetic revolt against algorithmic perfection. And if you listen carefully, the soundtrack hums with mechanical noises slowly fading into organic sounds, machines into rain, notifications into breathing, technology melting back into life. On this second viewing, the romance feels secondary, like a disguise the writers wear to smuggle philosophy into our hearts without us noticing until the credits roll. The last scene, Adrian tossing his smartwatch into the ocean, first felt grandiose, but from this angle it becomes deeply ironic. He throws away time, literally, to finally enter the timelessness of being. The crowd that once called him the miracle CEO realizes too late that the miracle wasn't his company's success but his surrender. Online, audiences who re-examined the show under this lens began debating its layered messaging. Threads sprung up arguing that it's an allegory of Southeast Asia's digital transformation, while others claimed it's an existential commentary disguised as corporate soap. Both interpretations are valid because that's what real art does, it multiplies meaning. Watching fan edits juxtapose Mirani's gentle chaos with Adrian's mechanical precision highlights the core merger the series celebrates: heart and logic, dream and schedule, chaos and symphony. And somewhere between those contradictions, we find beauty. The miracle isn't supernatural, it's infrastructural, it rewires how we see success. Episode by episode, the show dismantles a worldview one habit at a time. The business slogans become ironically gospel verses about emptiness, the glowing office lights turn into twilight lanterns guiding lost souls home. Even the coffee Mirani serves acts as recurring symbolism, a daily ritual of surrender, bitter and warm, calming and rousing at once, as if to say, taste this contradiction, it's what being human means. Taking this analytical angle transforms keajaibanku into a mirror through which audiences can examine their own desire to manage, predict, and optimize every second. What if the miracle we keep chasing through progress metrics is just peace? What if downtimes and stumbles are sacred, not shameful? That's the subtext humming beneath every scene once you tilt your focus just slightly. And the beauty of this reinterpretation lies in how it doesn't erase the romantic reading but enriches it. Love as surrender, surrender as revolution. Every supposedly slow scene now feels loaded with tension because it's not dragging plot forward, it's untying knots in the soul. The cultural resonance grows deeper when you remember the show's hybrid nature. Indonesian heart, Chinese rhythm, global audience, and realize that its very making mirrors its message: coordination through chaos, collaboration through difference. The miracle exists not only inside the story but in how the story itself exists, a cross-cultural harmony that shouldn't work yet somehow does. It's filmmaking that imitates faith, irrational, daring, luminous. Viewed through this new angle, the miracle that began as a personal gift becomes structural, the miracle of storytelling that unites strangers across languages. Watching it again felt like meditating. The tempo slows, the world narrows, and every detail, a drop of coffee, a sigh, a tear, feels orchestrated by some benevolent hand reminding us that perfection was never the goal, honesty was. In a landscape saturated with formulaic dramas, keajaibanku dares to be quiet and watchful, and that silence feels revolutionary. It's rare that a piece of entertainment challenges how we organize our lives while still making us blush and grin over fictional lovers. That balance is the real sleight of hand here. Mirani's chaos and Adrian's order dance to form something that feels like music composed entirely of pauses, teaching us that maybe the universe itself runs on gentle disobedience. By peeling back the show's romantic veneer and examining it as a parable of control versus surrender, we uncover its true miracle: the courage to be uncertain in a world that demands constant certainty. When the final note fades and the mirror of analysis closes, we're left not with answers but with a quiet ache, the realization that maybe the next miracle is ours to create.